works with Professor Hughes Sana, looking for observational constraints on the products of binary interaction. So take it away, Julia.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Let me share my screen and put this in full screen mode. All right, I hope you can see this. I guess that's a yes. Nobody complains. Okay, great. Yes. Thanks. All right. So thanks a lot for the introduction, Amanda, and thanks a lot for having me here. As Amanda just said, I defended my PhD 2 weeks ago. So this is basically my last, let's say, official appointment before summer vacation, and I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, so what I want to talk about is on the possible binary origin of classical BE stars. And so in order to set the scene a bit, I first wanted to introduce the stars that I'm going to talk about. So as probably all of you know, stars come in different masses, and depending on their mass, they evolve differently. So there's a sort of border in between the B star regime, where there's the late B stars that will become white dwarfs at the end of their lives, and there's the early B stars that will explode as a supernova and become neutron stars, and then there's even more massive early B-type stars or O stars that will end their lives after their supernova as a black hole. These stars are important in many senses. First of all, because they produce a lot of ionizing radiation. The more massive ones have strong winds. They give feedback to their surroundings. And therefore, it's very important to understand how these OB stars evolve. When studying a population of stars, however, for example, like the one I'm showing you here, the 30 Doradus region in the LMC, it has been shown by observations that actually most of these stars don't evolve as linearly as this first slide has just implied, where there's just one star that we have to take into account. But these observations have shown that if we look at massive stars, lots of them live in binary systems. So they have a companion close by, and like a majority of them is actually close enough so that they will actually interact during their lives. The binary fraction that has been observed for B stars is around 50%, though there are still some question marks. For O stars, it's even higher, but it's very clear that this has a very important impact on the life cycle of these kind of stars. It does not only impact this formation of these stars, which we need to understand how do they form in these binary systems or higher order multiple systems, which are actually also quite common, but also that will have an impact on their entire lives. So these stars will evolve. The more massive one will undergo its evolution. At some point, probably it will expand. And if the companion is close enough, then they can interact. And then, of course, depending on the type of system we have and the orbital period, for example, and the mass ratio, different kinds of channels can occur. And I'm just showing one example here, but this already shows that binary interactions will complicate the lives of stars because there is different channels that can occur. But so the one that I'm focusing on here is mass transfer, where the more massive star evolves, and at some point it will fill its Roche lobe and transfer mass to its companion star. It is then stripped of its envelope, while the companion accretes mass, but also angular momentum, strongly affecting both of these stars' lives. And then, depending on the mass of the system, just one possible example, what could happen in the further evolution is that the more massive star, if it's massive enough, explodes as a supernova. And if the system remains bound, then this might lead to the formation of a system such as a Hymer-6 binary, for example. And if the companion is also massive enough, then this can lead to things like gravitational wave mergers, which we've now been observing quite frequently. But so it's important to understand how to actually get there. And while this is more or less the life cycle of binary stars, just one example for it, there's still a lot of question marks, basically on every step of the process. How do these stars form? What are the initial conditions on these binary products? We actually have also a lot of questions still on single star cell evolution. So for example, what the role of the rotation in these stars is and how it impacts their evolution. But then if you put a companion star next to it, you also need to understand the interaction physics. What is the outcome of the interaction? And then depending on that, what is the further evolution of the systems? And what will this in the end lead to, for example, in the context of gravitational wave progenitors? And so what I want to focus on in this talk is what I call binary interaction products. So stars that had a companion and that have interacted already, either through mass transfer, or they could be mergers where actually the two stars merged and became one. because I think we can learn a lot from these interaction products on the interaction physics and also on the outcome of the interaction. Actually, what is left behind after after two stars have interacted in such a binary system. We can look at this from a simulation point of view. So what has been predicted by simulations is that if we assume continuous star formation, and if we take the observed O star binary properties, so the fact that 70% of O stars are in binary systems, simulations have shown that if we look at continuous star formation, we find that actually there's a significant fraction of a population of stars that will be binary interaction products. And in this particular simulation, as I said, assuming O star binary properties, this would be 30% of the entire population. So if we look at such a population, then actually the number of stars that have interacted already is significant. And then either they are merger products, they are these semi-detached systems which are currently interacting, or they're post-mass transfer system where one of the stars was stripped of its envelope. And then of course, there's a fraction of stars that are either single or that didn't have time yet to interact. We can also look at that as a function of age in one population of stars. So if we assume a star cluster, then there is also simulations that have tried to predict what is the function, what is the number of these interaction products with respect to other stars in the same population of stars. For example, in this simulation with respect to stars that are 2 magnitudes fainter. So what this diagram shows is how the number of interaction products changes over cluster age with respect to stars that are 2 magnitudes fainter. And it shows that if we choose the right cluster age in a star cluster, then actually there is a lot of binary interaction products that should be there. And if we observe these kind of clusters, then we have a high chance of finding interaction products. And this was even taken one step further very recently by Wang et al., who simulated such an entire population of stars, assuming a binary fraction of 100%. And what they tried to do is try to predict how these kind of stars would look like in a color magnitude diagram or a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. So the plots that I'm showing here are these simulated populations of stars, where the left one is at an age of 2 million years of this simulated cluster, and the right one is after 30 million years. And what it shows is that binary interaction products actually dominate these Hertzsprung-Russell or color magnitude diagrams of these clusters, because they appear in very distinct and different parts of this diagram than the single stars. So in a very young cluster, around 2 million years, most of the stars didn't have time to interact yet. So we see what we would assume to see for a population of single stars, which is one main sequence, which is shown here by the blue dots. And actually there's way more blue stars, but they're just hidden basically on top of each other in the way this is plotted. However, if we wait for 30 million years, then a lot of these systems had time to interact already. And suddenly there's other regions in the color magnitude or Hertzsprung-Russell diagram which become populated, for example, by merger stars, which appear above the main sequence, which we observationally would call blue stragglers, stars that seem younger than they should be with respect to their sibling stars in a star cluster. And what is also interesting is that there seems to be a second main sequence appearing to the right of the normal main sequence. So stars that are hotter than the normal single star main sequence, which in this simulation was shown that those are post-mass transfer systems. So the companion star that has gained mass, but also angular momentum, was spun up and now appears cooler because it's now rapidly rotating. And so these simulations predict that if we observe a cluster or a population of stars, actually we will find a lot of binary interaction products. And this combined with the fact that actually in young populations of stars, like 30 Doradus, for example, we find that a majority of the massive stars are in binary systems, tells us that there should be a lot of interaction products out there that we can use in order to study the interactions themselves. But so how do we do this? How do we find them? If we look at a population of stars, this is just one example, NGC 330, a cluster in the SMC that will come back later. How do we know from an observational side which stars are actually single stars? Which stars are binary systems or stars in binary systems that didn't have time to interact yet? So they're still orbiting each other and they had nothing to do with each other yet. And how do we find these different types of binary interaction products, either mass gainers or merger products? What are the observational characteristics we can use in order to detect them? One of them I already basically mentioned is, if we look at such a population of stars, then we would expect different binary properties to be observed. Because first of all, mergers are not binary stars anymore. And also, if we look at a post-mass transfer system, then from an observational side, it's much more difficult to detect a companion. So if we give these binary systems time to evolve, then it will be much harder to detect the companions, and we would observe a much lower binary fraction in these kind of clusters. Also, as I've just shown, simulations predict that these interaction products would sit in a different position in the Hertzsprung-Russell or Keller magnitude diagram and be rejuvenated with respect to their other cluster members, depending on the type of interaction that occurs. And another very important observational characteristic that I want to focus on in the remainder of this talk is high rotation rates. For merger stars, it's still not clear yet, but for stars that are the mass gainers in these systems, it is thought that they are spun up to rapid rotation. So actually the rotation rates can tell us something about binary interaction products too. And of course, this list is not exhaustive. There's a lot of other characteristics that can be used, but the first three and mainly the third point are the ones that I want to focus on. So if we can use high rotation rates to trace binary interaction products, or at least possible candidates for binary interaction products, then there's one type of stars that at least comes to my mind, which are classical BE stars. Classical BE stars, well, they're defined to be rapidly rotating, which is what I've just said, and also to be non-radially pulsating B-type stars that form a circumstellar decretion disk around them, which leads to this observational signature, which I'm just showing for 3 example stars. Just 3 famous BE stars, and I'm just showing 3 spectral lines, so the H beta line, the H alpha line, and the helium-1 line, which shows this very characteristic emission. I just want to stress one thing, which is I'm an observer, so from an observational side, there's a very strong difference between a classical BE star, which has this physical interpretation that I've just mentioned, and the observations, which can only mostly tell us about whether something is classified as a BE star, so a B-type star that has emissions. And there's a lot of possible confusions with other objects. For example, young stellar objects, magnetic stars, blue supergiants, interacting binaries that also have the same observational signature, B-type stars with Balmer lines and emission, but physically they are very different objects. And it's always difficult to figure out which ones are which. And it's important to keep in mind. But if we now go back to the classical BE stars, where we think the interpretation is that these are these rapidly rotating stars with a circumstellar decreasing disk, then what has been shown is that around 20% of the B stars show this BE phenomenon. So it's actually quite common in the Milky Way, at least. It has been shown that it's a transient phenomenon. So BE stars can show this emission. Later they can't on timescales of a few years or decades, but it can also come back. So apparently there's a mechanism that leads to a replenishing and a destruction of the disk, which then leads to the observed emission features. And it's still not clear yet how close these stars are actually rotating to their critical velocity. And there's a lot of debate ongoing, and it's observationally quite difficult to figure out how close they are actually to critical. But what I think is the most striking question is why are they actually rapidly rotating? Why are there 20% of the B-type stars that are rapid rotators? And how can we explain this in terms of stellar evolution? There have been different channels that have been proposed in order to explain this rotation. I divide them in 2 groups. I call them the single star channels and the binary channels. And first I want to focus on the single star channel, where the idea is either that these stars are born as rapid rotators, but observationally, there's a few arguments that speak against this being the dominant channels. I'm not going to focus on this any further, but I want to focus on the other single star channel, which predicts that stars can get close to their critical velocity as single stars while they evolve along the main sequence. So basically, they approach the critical velocity because they spin up and because the critical velocity is reduced, so they get closer to that. And there's a few theoretical predictions that say that this is definitely a valid channel if it's enough to be at 70% critical, to appear as a BE star, which is based on recent works by Hastings et al. But also they predict that there should be nitrogen enrichment in these BE stars, which, at least as far as I know, has not been observed, but is also difficult to observe. Observationally, what we would expect if the single star channel is the dominant one for BE star formation, then you would expect BE stars to be at the end of their main sequence evolution, because that's when these stars, according to the models, approach the critical velocity. They should also have similar binary properties as normal B-type star, because they just become rapid rotators on their own without any impact of a companion star. And they shouldn't have any peculiar space velocity with respect to stars in the same population of stars, for example. But what about the binary channel? According to the binary channel, the idea is that BE stars gain angular momentum because they have received mass due to mass transfer or slope overflow in a binary system. So they are the mass gainers, the previous secondary, while the primary was stripped of its envelope and is now, well, either a stripped star, or it has evolved already, is a white dwarf, a neutron star, a black hole, or the system was disrupted in a supernova explosion. What the theoretical predictions are for this channel is a bit more vague. There have been different works. They have shown that either this binary channel, theoretically, can account for a minority, half, or all of the BE stars. So theory is not really converging on how important this channel can be. And also, again, there was recent work by Hastings et al., which find that according to the binary channel, when assuming rather, let's say, extreme binary physics, they can account for all the observed BE stars in clusters with assuming they are all binary interaction products. But again, they assume rather extreme physics in order to get there. So the theoretical side tells us both of these channels can work. And what I want to focus on is the observational side, because for the binary channel, the observational properties of these stars would be rather different. So if BE stars are actually predominantly binary interaction products, then we would expect them to appear at any point during the main sequence evolution, because you don't have to wait till the star reaches critical velocity on its own. It depends on what the companion star does and when it transfers the mass. Also, you would expect that there is a lack of close BE star plus main sequence companions, because you need the mass transfer from the companion in order to spin up the BE star, which is a very clear observational test that can be done. And you would expect that if these BE stars are interaction products, then they should have companions, or they were the system was disrupted in a supernova explosion. But if it wasn't disrupted, then they should have companions, which is for the lower mass stars, either white dwarfs or stripped stars or neutron stars or black holes. And again, this is a very observational, an easy way of, well, not easy, but I'll come to that. But this is a way that can be tested observationally. And so in the remainder of my talk, what I want to focus on are, first of all, do we actually know classical BE stars with main sequence companions, which would argue for the single star channel, because as I said, in the binary channel, you wouldn't expect those. What kind of companions to BE stars do we actually know? And how do we put this in context with the formation channel of them? And what happens if we actually look at a cluster, so a co-evo stellar population with these binary simulations in mind? How do they fit in? And all of this in order to figure out which one of these channels for the formation of BE stars is actually the dominant one. Do all of them work? Do we observe them? Do we observe evidence for them? Or is there one that is the more dominating one? So if we now focus on the first point, the question is, are there any reports of BE stars that have a main sequence companion? And as I said, according to the binary channel, you would expect a lack. So in order to test that, what we did is we did a literature study of a sample of around 300 BE stars. We selected the massive ones, which then ensures that their previous companions were also massive stars. So they have exploded as a supernova. So we focused on stars that are of earlier spectral type than B1.5. And what we did is we looked in the literature to see if there's any reports of those stars on close orbits with a BE star with a main sequence star companion. Of course, this doesn't take into account triples, which complicate the picture even more than already just the binaries. But if we put this in relation to the observed binary properties of B stars, where we find that around 50% at least have another companion, which is mostly a main sequence star, then this gives a handle on what are the binary properties of BE stars. So what we did is we went through the literature and we looked if we find any reports. Of course, the literature for the different stars is very different. So some stars have been studied in detail. Some stars have 10,000 spectra available. Other stars maybe have only been looked at once in the 1980s. So this is a very difficult thing. And which is also why I call the first group of stars that we found or defined in the study presumably single, which means either they are truly single, which of course is always difficult to say, or they haven't been studied enough yet in order to detect a possible companion. Then we define a second group of stars where someone has claimed that there is a companion, but actually it's not really clear what is the nature of the companion. And I will come back to those in a minute. And then there's this group of BE stars which are known to have non-main sequence companions. So for example, high mass X-ray binaries, where the companion is probably a neutron star. However, what was the important and interesting result of the study is that in the whole literature, there was no unambiguous report of any main sequence plus BE star, which is, as I said, in agreement with what you would expect if they are binary interaction products. As I said as well, this is difficult because it's a literature study. So we tried our best to at least get an idea of the detection biases that could have been in place in those studies in the literature. But of course, different works, different people, different mindsets. So this is very difficult to estimate. But if we try to do a very conservative estimate of the detection biases, and also take into account that, as I said before, B stars have a binary fraction with main sequence companions of around 50%. If we combine these two things, then what we actually find is this is very well in agreement with the fact or the idea that massive BE stars are binary interaction products. Just based on the fact that there's no main sequence companions observed to them. So already this first point gives us an idea where there seems to be a lack of observed main sequence companions to BE stars. As I said, it was a literature study. So what would actually be a more stringent test would be to have homogeneous spectroscopy of all of them. But for now, this is all the data or the literature that was available. But it gives already an idea because, as I said, main sequence companions are much easier to detect than these stripped star or neutron star or black hole companions, on which I want to focus now, because those are the kind of companions that are known to classical BE stars. The first ones I want to mention are two particular examples. I want to mention them because I find them very striking, and I'm sure you've heard of them many, many times. The first one is Gamma Cas. I'm going to show the second one already. It's Delta SCO. They are two of the brightest BE stars that are known. You can see them with your bare eyes. They've been studied for years and years, and still it's not clear what kind of companions they have. So both of them have a binary companion. It was found for Gamma Cas that it has a period of around 200 days. For Delta SCO, it's around 11 years. But for both systems, there's still big question marks, despite the fact that they're very bright and that they've been studied very, very well. So this gives an idea of how complicated these kind of systems can be. And again, keeping the point in mind that main sequence companions, at least the ones that are detected next to normal B-type stars, are detected abundantly with much less data. So this is again a point saying, for the BE stars, we even detect these exotic companions on periods of 11 years, while we don't detect main sequence companions to them. And then in a bit of a more general sense, what kind of evolved companions do we know next to BE stars? There has been a few detections of subdwarf O or B-type stars, mostly subdwarf O stars, I think. So stripped stars, either in the optical by either detecting them directly or by their impact on the BE star disk, and mainly also in the UV, for example, using IUE data or using HST data. There have been a handful of detections where subdwarfs were detected next to BE stars. And of course, in the UV, it's much easier to detect these kind of very hot compact stars because their contribution to the spectrum is much higher. And then on the other hand, there have been detections of BE X-ray binaries, so mostly BE stars plus neutron stars. And then there's this one famous example of an X-ray quiet BE plus black hole binary, MWC656, which, as far as I know, is one of the very few X-ray quiet black holes in a binary system, and a lot of people are looking for more. But I think this is one of the very few non-disputed accepted detections of one of them. And again, these stars are much more difficult to detect than main sequence stars. Then also people have looked at the runaway properties, so the spatial motion of BE stars. And I just want to highlight one study, which is by Boudbert and Evans, who looked at the kinematic properties of a sample of BE stars in a galaxy. They found that around 13% of them are runaway stars, and they did their own binary population simulations and argued that this is in agreement with the binary channel, that they are ejected because their companion exploded as a supernova. Another study I want to highlight is a recent one by Clement et al., in which they looked at the SCD of classical BE stars, so the spectral energy distribution, with the argument that if there is a companion next to these BE stars, it should have an impact on the disk. So it should truncate the disk, which we should detect in the SCD. And they find that actually there's many classical BE stars that show this turn down in their SCD, which is indicative of a companion next to them. They cannot really say what kind of a companion that is, but again, if it was a main sequence star with a similar mass, it probably should have detected in spectroscopy, should have been. And now I want to mention two very famous examples, which probably you've heard of, LB1 and HI6819. I want to focus on the second one, HI6819, mainly because we have the better data set for that one, which is also interesting in that context. But let me first introduce the system. So in, well, around a year ago, I guess, HI6819 became famous because it was proposed to be a triple system, which contains a black hole, which would have been then the closest black hole to Earth with a B star in an inner binary system, and a BE star on an outer tertiary orbit. For me, that was actually very interesting because that would have been a direct proof that the BE star has formed according to the single star channel, unless you make this a quadruple system previously that had interacted already. But of course, we can make things even more complicated. But so this could be one of the very like smoking gun examples of the single star channel working for a BE star formation. But so let's see how that interpretation came into place. And for that, I want to show you the data that this was actually based on, which is a data set of ferrospectra. And I'm focusing here on a region around H alpha. And I've marked the two contributions which are visible in the spectrum, which is a composite spectrum. First of all, there is the strong H alpha emission, which is attributed to the BE star. And second, there is another star, which is here indicated as the B star, which, for example, here shows this absorption lines in carbon. And what can be seen in this sequence of spectra, which covers around 1 year in time, and I just shifted them to make them better visible. What can be seen here is that the B star is moving. So what this seems to be is a stationary H alpha line and the B star that seems to be moving. But given that the BE star seems to be stationary, the B star must be moving around something else. And this is why it was proposed that there's a black hole in the system, and the B star is actually moving around that black hole, which we don't observe because it's an X-ray quiet black hole, while the BE star is on the observational timescale stationary, which would argue for the fact that it's on a wider outer orbit and unrelated to the inner system. So as I said, this was the first interpretation of the system as a triple system. However, what we did in Leuven is we looked back at the system also with the second system, LB1 in mind, which we had analyzed a few weeks beforehand. And what we did is we used a technique called spectral disentangling, where we assume the orbital parameters and we try to disentangle this composite spectrum to get the two spectra of the two stars that contribute to it. And when we do this technique, what we found is that actually we can come up with an alternative explanation that equally well explains the data. And what we argue is that this could equally well be a binary system, because we argue that actually the BE star, which looks like it is stationary, is actually also moving, just much slower than what was expected. And that the star that was called a B star is actually not a normal B-type star, but we argue that it's of much lower mass, which we find from the analysis of the spectrum, but also from the analysis of the dynamics of the system. So what we argue is that this is a binary system where there is a stripped star that appears like a B star, because this is what the temperature and the log G would imply for that kind of star. And the BE star is moving around it. But given that the mass of the B-type star is much lower than a normal B star, you wouldn't expect such a high motion of the BE star moving around it. So we argue that with this alternative explanation, you don't need a black hole in the system, and you can explain this system actually as the perfect example of the binary channel that forms BE star, because we argue this is just a system where the B-type star was recently stripped of its envelope, and the BE star is a BE star because it accreted mass, but also angular momentum from its companion. As I said, this is a big question mark. We hopefully will get new data soon. Actually, the system is close enough by that we can use interferometry to actually see if we should be able to resolve the system if it is in this triple star configuration. So with interferometry, we would be able to resolve the BE star and the B star as two light sources if they are according to this triple configuration. And if not, then we have an argument that this is actually in the binary configuration. So new data is hopefully coming to solve the problem. I just want to highlight two more papers. First of all, another one by Clement et al. Very recently, who found a very similar system where there's also an outer BE star, which is around an inner binary system, which of course in that context is also very interesting because it would also be a direct proof of this BE star forming as a single star if you don't assume 4 stars to have been in the beginning. And the second paper was actually on the arXiv yesterday, which argues for the system being a binary system based on based on isolated binary evolution models. They argued that actually this black hole in the inner binary system, according to this triple star scenario, is very unlikely according to the models. So I'm just showing this because I want to say this is a hot topic. This is very highly discussed still. I'm very curious what the answer is going to be. But if we for a second assume that we can explain the system according to the binary channel, then I want to show what we can learn from these sorts of systems. So let's assume the system has formed according to the binary channel. What we have determined in terms of parameters of the system are correct. So we have a mass for the BE star, we have a mass for the stripped star. Then we argue that this system is actually right in between the phase of post-mass transfer and before the system has settled and the stripped star has settled into something like a subdwarf star. And right now it is contracting towards that phase. So what we did is we've calculated evolutionary models with a more or less proper initial guess, which then leads to similar observational properties of the system that we observe today. And so what we have shown is that we can trace back the evolutionary history and we can explain the system as a system that has undergone case A mass transfer. And what this plot shows here is just the evolution of the model that we've computed for the stripped star. So it shows, I hope you can see my mouse, the position on the 0H main sequence. And as the star evolves, it indicates the point in the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram where case A's mass transfer starts. Then it undergoes mass transfer and at some point it detaches. And currently what we're observing is marked by this cross in the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. So what we argue is the stripped star is currently contracting. It will become a subdwarf at some point, but we're observing it in this phase where it's still on its way of getting there. And we argue that it's actually easier to observe it then because it's still puffed up and it's much brighter than it will be once it has contracted and is a subdwarf star. And again, if we assume that this is the configuration of the system that really explains it, then we can also basically look back in time in terms of orbital parameters. and we can learn something about the mass transfer efficiency of this binary system. So what this plot shows is basically how the period of the system evolves as a function of the mass ratio. So basically the x-axis shows the mass ratio, but also the evolution in time. And we can use what we have observed in terms of a mass ratio today, and then assume that the orbit is circular and that the mass transfer efficiency is constant, which of course are assumptions. But basically we can go back in time and see how the system would have started at some point, assuming either with continuous lines that the mass transfer was conservative, or assuming the other extreme, that the mass transfer was fully non-conservative. And so this is what we did. And we've also overplotted, which are marked in green, observed binary systems in that parameter space. And given that assuming fully non-conservative mass transfer would imply very, very short orbital periods of that system, we argue that actually if this is the correct configuration, then this points in the direction of conservative mass transfer having undergone in the system, which is actually in line with what people find that study subdwarfs. And so from these kind of systems, we can learn something about the binary interaction physics. But as I said, this is a very debated system. And also it's just one. So what sorry, and there's also LB1, but for that one, the data is a bit more, well, it is not as bright as HR6819. So the data that we have for the other one is much better. But so yeah, as I just said, what kind of BE star companions are known? Well, there's mostly compact objects and stripped stars. And then there is HR6819, which we're still not sure about, but possibly it could be a post-mass transfer system. As I was just saying, this is just one system. And maybe if we take LB1, that's two. But that's not, well, that's just two. But what we can do is we can look at an entire population of stars, because then we can learn more about more like a statistical consideration of these kind of systems. So what I want to focus on in the last 10 minutes is what about BE stars in a star cluster, so in a co-evo stellar population. And for that, I want to bring back the cluster that I've shown all the way in the beginning, NGC 330, which I spent a lot of time working on during my PhD. We selected it for observations in the beginning because it has an intermediate age, so around 35 million years. And the simulations that I've shown in the beginning that showed the number of interaction products as a function of cluster age indicate that there should be a lot of binary interaction products in this cluster, which is why we selected it for observations. It was also previously known to contain a large number of BE stars from previous studies already, so it was definitely an interesting target. What I'm showing on the left is what the cluster core looks like with HST observations. So photometry that were obtained with HST. What I'm going to show now is how this cluster looks like observed with MUSE at the VLT, which is an integral field unit. So this is what it looks like with MUSE, but the difference is what we have right now is not only this image, but each pixel has a spectrum. So this is the nice thing that MUSE can do. It provides a spectrum in the optical range in each of its pixels. And just to show you an example, I'm showing 4 spectra of stars that we have observed in NGC 330 with MUSE, just to give an idea of the wavelength coverage, the spectral resolution, and everything. Of course, well, we get spectra for all the stars in the cluster, which is around 400 stars, but the resolution is not great. So it's between 2000 and 4000. But just as an example, I'm showing from top to bottom a BE star, a B star, a blue supergiant, and a red supergiant that we have observed in this cluster. And so, as I said, we can take all the brightest stars, so the most massive stars in the cluster core, and extract spectra for them, which is what I've done. And we can use that combined with the photometry from HST, which is of very high quality, of course, in order to create a color magnitude diagram, which we can inform by spectroscopy. So basically what I'm showing here is the color magnitude diagram of NGC 330. And all the stars for which we could extract spectra for, which is around 400, are shown with color. So basically each color dot is a star that we have a spectrum for. And we can use the spectra to, well, first of all, classify what kind of star that is. And in this plot, I'm showing B stars in yellow, BE stars in green, blue supergiants in blue, and red supergiants in red. And you can already see one thing which is actually very common for these types of clusters, which is that there seems to be this overabundance of BE stars, which are offset to the main sequence to the right of it, which is hereby spectroscopically confirmed because we have spectra for these stars. And if you remember back to what I told you in the beginning, the simulations also predict that there is this second sequence of stars which are post-mass transfer objects, which are rapidly rotating and appear cooler than the normal single star main sequence. So what we can also do is we can look at the number of BE stars as a function of magnitude. So what I'm showing here is a histogram of the HST magnitudes at 8,000, around 8,000 angstrom. So basically it's the y-axis of the left plot. And I'm showing the number of BE stars versus B stars, and also in gray, the BE star fraction as a function of magnitude. And I've also indicated more or less where the cluster turnoff is. And so what you can see is that above the main sequence turnoff, there's basically 50% or 45% of BE stars. So basically they dominate the cluster turnoff. Again, this is an observational definition, BE stars. This could, for example, be classical BE stars, but it could also be interacting binaries with a disk that appear observationally as BE stars. What is also important is that below the cluster turnoff, there's also BE stars. So basically, if we think back about the single star channel for BE stars, then you wouldn't expect any unevolved BE stars because they should become BE stars when they end their main sequence evolution. And in such a cluster, you wouldn't expect them to be way below the turnoff, but they are. So another indication for at least those to be impacted by binary companions and to have gained a rapid rotation like that. What we can also do with the Muse data is we can get stellar parameters. So again, the resolution is not great, which especially for the rotational velocities is a problem because we have a certain limit in rotational velocities that we're just not sensitive to because the instrumental resolution. But so what we've been doing is we've determined stellar parameters based on the spectroscopy from Muse, so on optical spectroscopy, combined with the HST photometry, which allows us to derive effective temperatures, surface gravities, rotation rates, and also the luminosities of the stars, giving this combined fit of spectroscopy and photometry. What I want to focus on this context is the rotation rates that we have derived. And here I'm only first of all showing the B stars, which of course are much easier to fit these stellar parameters for because their spectra are not impacted by emission lines. And so this is the rotational velocity distribution we obtained for the B stars in NGC 330. Again, there's this resolution limit below which we're not sensitive to. And then we can do a similar thing for the BE stars. It's more difficult to fit their atmospheres, as I said, because of the emission lines in the spectrum. But so what I've done is I've taken the B-type stars and I've made a correlation between the V sin I that we measure, so the rotational velocities, and the full width half maximum of a helium line. So that basically gives a correlation between the helium line, full width half max, and the rotational velocities. And I've applied that to the BE stars. And this is what I'm showing here. And so what we find for NGC 330, in agreement with everything we would expect, I guess, is that the BE stars in NGC 330 are on average rotating more rapidly. Again, there's the resolution limit under which we're not sensitive to. But yeah, so we find that on average, the BE stars are more rapidly rotating. And then there's one more thing we can do, which is we have 6 epochs of observations. So what we can do is we can look for binaries. As I said, the resolution is low, so we're not really, we have to take care of our sensitivity because, yeah, and we only have 6 epochs. But so what I've done is measured radial velocities via Gaussian fitting and also inspected the spectra to see if there's any indications for composite spectra in terms of sp2s, so double-line spectroscopic binaries. And here I'm just showing one example of a star that I've classified as a binary star, where you can see helium lines on the left in the 2 panels and the 6 epochs of observations and the thereof derived radial velocities on the right. And so I've done this for around 300 stars in NGC 330. And now I'm showing you again the same color magnitude diagram on the right, but now also classified with binary information. And what I want to draw your attention to is that in this region offset of the main sequence, where we expect, or where we find observationally that the BE stars are, the binary fraction is very, very low. And again, we're not sensitive to detecting stripped stars or neutron stars or black holes, most likely in these kind of systems. So this again is in agreement with the BE stars being binary interaction products. So just to sum it up, and I also think I'm basically at the end of my time, there's a few things that I want to stress that I think we've learned from NGC 330, which is that first of all, there's a lot of BE stars in this cluster, and the turnoff is actually dominated by them. Second, there are these unevolved BE stars in NGC 330, which are below the cluster turnoff, which are in agreement with them being binary interaction products. And if we look at, or if we compare the observed binary fractions of BE stars and B stars, we find that the one of BE stars is significantly lower, which either means it is truly lower, or we can't detect the companions anymore, or the post, well, if it was a binary system before, and the periods are longer now, then we're also less likely to detect those. So just to sum it up, what I want to argue is that at least some, but probably maybe most of the massive classical BE stars could be binary interaction products. And if they are, then they are the ideal place, first of all, to look for these interesting objects that basically a lot of people are looking for, which are stripped stars or neutron stars, or especially X-ray quiet black holes. And if BE stars are binary interaction products, then they also provide immediate constraints on binary interaction physics. And if they're not, then actually they're also interesting because they provide constraints on single star, not interaction, on single star physics, like the rotation rates. And therefore I want to argue that they're very interesting objects to study in that context, and in order to learn more about this complicated life cycle of binary stars that I've shown in the beginning. So I think that's all I wanted to say, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Julia. It was an excellent talk. Thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions, you can either write them in the chat, or you can just turn off your mutes and speak up. Oh, there's a question in the chat, Julia, if you can. Do you want me to read it for you?
Yes, please. Okay,
so in one of the slides, you represented HB, H-beta, H-alpha, and helium profiles for a classical BE star. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on why we see emission in helium, which is expected to originate from the photosphere?
Well, there should also be helium in the disk, right? Not helium-2, because I think helium-2, the temperatures are not there in the disk, but helium-1, I think is commonly formed also in the disk, and then leads to these emission profiles that we see.
Okay, so Carol was also asking, what are your next steps for NGC 330?
That's a good question. So first of all, I'm going to just go back to that slide because I hope I don't have to go too much. Yeah. So what we've been doing so far is we've only looked at the binary properties, but there's actually more information that is in there, which is we only have 6 epochs, so we can't derive full orbital solutions for these systems. But we can look at the periods, or well, the period is the wrong word, but we can look at what is the timescales on which we observe these binary systems. So we've probed different timescales because we have observations that have like 1 night in between, 10 nights in between, a year in between, and we can see on which timescales we see variability in the different kinds of systems. And we're currently looking into that, and it seems like that the ones that are BE stars are actually on these longer timescales, which would be interesting. So that's one of the things we definitely want to do. And what I haven't focused at all on today is all the other interesting stars that are there. And I just want to point out the ones that are up here, which are these observationally called blue straggler stars, which are above the cluster turnoff, which cannot be explained as single stars, and for which there's also very stringent theoretical predictions, in particular for the ones where people think they're mergers. So the predictions are mergers would be slowly rotators. And so that's one of the things we want to test. What are the rotation rates of the stars that are up here? And actually, can we see something in the abundances? Because there's also predictions for what are the abundances of these kind of stars. So that's the two main things we're currently working on. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
So I also have a question.
Of course.
Okay, so you mentioned that you were going to get interferometry for HR 6819, right?
Yeah.
Is there any plans to get interferometry for LB1? I know it's further away and it's fainter, but is there any chance that we can get more data on that one too?
As far as I know, not with the current instrumentation and not in terms of interferometry. So I think that won't work as far as we are with current instrumentation. So we would have to be a bit more patient for that. But yeah, so we have to focus on HR 6819 for now, I guess, which is much brighter and therefore much easier to observe.
Mm-hmm. So Matthew has his hand up. Go ahead, Matthew.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk, Dr. Bodensteiner, and thank you and congratulations on finishing your PhD. So, as I'm sure you know, you mentioned magnetic fields earlier, and of course, binary mergers have been suggested as the origin of the magnetic stars as well. So it seems interesting to me that we have sort of two very different types of objects, rapid rotators with no magnetic fields from, I guess, more gradual forms of mass transfer versus strongly magnetic stars that are generally slower rotators, presumably from more rapid merger processes. I found your cluster analysis particularly interesting in that regard, and I was wondering if you had any ideas for how to do something similar for the magnetic population.
Given that it's in the SMC, we have no information about which of the stars are magnetic.
No, not in the SMC, but it could be done galactically.
Sorry?
In galactic clusters, for instance.
That would be definitely interesting, and I'm more or less sure that people are doing that. So yeah, that would definitely be very interesting. And then I guess it would be also good to figure out which stars. As I said, you can mistake BE stars as magnetic stars. So that would definitely be interesting. In terms of a cluster environment, as far as I know, you would always expect the mergers to be to the left and above the main sequence, depending on when they actually merged. So if you have a cluster environment, you actually get a lot of extra information that helps you figuring out what is the past history of that kind of star. So that would definitely be very interesting.
In terms of confusing them for BE stars, you said?
Do you mean for classical BE stars?
Do you mean that because some of them have H alpha emission?
Yes, exactly.
That's actually really easy to distinguish. You just look to see if the H alpha emission is outside of V side I.
Okay, true. But if you, I'm just thinking back to our literature study, where some of the literature classification were from the 70s or the 80s.
Oh yeah, yeah, I know. I've come across that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I guess with recent observational techniques, you could probably easily distinguish that.
Which actually leads to another question I just thought of. So in your spectroscopic study of NGC 3330, did you find any candidate magnetic stars?
So I think the limiting
outside of V side I.
The limiting thing here is the resolution. So maybe I can just go back. Where is my mouse?
Of course, but if you have V sine I of 300 kilometers per second well outside your resolution limit, which is sometimes the case for rapidly rotating magnetic stars.
Yeah. I haven't looked at this in particular, but it's definitely a very good point, and I'm going to look at it. So thanks a lot for raising it.
Statistically, you'd expect a few of them. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Okay, so Dietrich has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Julia, I think this was one of the very best talks about BE stars I've ever heard.
Thank you.
Really beautiful.
Thanks a lot.
There is one mysterious thing that one could say and add about HR 6819. There's a single speckle interferometry observation, which has found a companion star, whether it's a physical companion or just a chance alignment and so forth, we don't know. And so, as you say, we are very curious to receive the first VLTI observations.
Definitely,
and we have been corona'd out again, but maybe we'll still get some data.
Fingers crossed, yeah.
Concerning NGC 330.
Yes.
Have you tried to compare the spatial distribution of the BE stars with respect to the rest of the cluster? Because from your earlier conclusions, one would expect that the BE stars have a broader spatial profile, their distribution.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna go back to this overview. So that's the first point I want to make. Actually, we're only looking at the very cluster core. So with our Muse observations, that's a bit more difficult. I haven't done this myself. Ben Hastings did this. He looked at the HST observations, where I'm just showing a cutout here. And the way that they were made is that they were made in 3 filters, but also a 4th very narrow band filter around H alpha. So they also have an idea of which stars show H alpha emission, and they cover a much broader range. And actually, Ben Hastings has figured out that there are more BE stars, so that, or let me say it differently, the fraction of BE stars increases when you go further out in the cluster, which would be in agreement of them being more dispersed than the B stars. But from the Muse observations, I think we're just too narrowed down to the cluster core.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, apparently not.
I think, no.
I've raised my hand again, if that's okay.
Oh, okay.
Good, thank you. I think, Julia, you have convinced us all with your work that BE stars as binary products do exist. And there is no question about this. The question is whether this is the one and only answer. And you have been very cautious in not claiming this. And at some point, your picture may break down when you go to lower mass BE stars.
Definitely.
And how would you see that? And in particular, you have mentioned New Geminorum, the paper by Robert Clement et al., where there is an outer BE star. And you say one shouldn't make things more complicated than they are already. So that would be an indication that this lower mass BE star formed as a quasi-single star because it's rather far away from the inner binary.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, also for the massive stars, we don't know yet, right? It's still an open question which channel dominates, and I'm pretty sure that all of them work. While, as I said before, we still need the smoking gun example for the single star channel. But yeah, I mainly, at least in the first part of the talk, focused on the massive stars, where also from an observational side, it seems like the more massive the star, the more likely it is that it has a close by companion. So I think this is the more dominant channel for the more massive stars, but I also don't want to argue that the single star channel doesn't work. And I think it's particularly important for the less massive stars, which are also definitely very interesting to study. But yeah, so I think it's going to be an interplay between both. And we still need to figure out the relative importance.
I agree. Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions?
May I have one? Peter Harmanet. Can I be heard?
Yes,
yes,
I can hear you.
Okay. I would like to comment on your study of this NGC cluster. I would like to warn you that basically, since majority of BE stars are probably observed under arbitrary inclination, they will exhibit positive correlation between brightness and emission strength. Therefore, if you select strong BE stars, you very probably do not get proper color diagram or HR diagram, whatever you construct, because simply the star will appear brighter. They will pretend to be something like supergiants because of the pseudo-photosphere, which increases apparent radius of which you observe. Therefore, I would be a bit cautious with the statement that that really there are two sequences in these diagrams you were showing. And second, would you agree that basically, since typical amplitudes for known BE stars in any kind of binaries is 5 to 10 kilometers per second, you actually would not be able to detect most of BE stars with the instrumentation you used?
Definitely.
With the small resolution?
Yes, I fully agree. We wouldn't be able to detect that sort of radio velocity amplitudes. Yeah, so that's just, we have to deal with that, and we have to model our biases, but yeah, we wouldn't detect them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? No, last chance.
Thanks a lot, Julia, for a great talk. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Thank you. And thanks again for inviting me.
No. Thank you. Okay.
It was a really great talk.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. I'm very interested in looking at these magnetic stars. So
there's a potentially interesting synergy between the two of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I would just like to remind you, if anyone wants to be added to the mailing list, to be reminded of these monthly talks, you should just write an email to us or put your email in the chat or something like that, and we can add you to the list. Thank you again, Julia. It was an excellent talk. And thank you, everyone, for coming, and see you in the next talk.
Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Bye-bye.